It is quite a privilege and honor for me to follow Julia today, and I'm going to tell a little bit more of her story. This is what drew me, talk about impact, into learning about algorithmic bias. So I'm going to take you back to, I think it's 2015, 2016 or so, and Brescia Borden is walking home with a friend of hers in Broward County, Florida, and she's running a little bit late to pick up, I think it was a godchild, and she sees a bicycle and a scooter in a yard, and she and her friend decide that will get them to pick up the godchild quicker, and they grab the bike and they grab the scooter, and they take off down the block, and then they realize these were the size for a 6-year-old, and they're not going to be terribly useful. They drop the items after somebody comes running after them, and it's a little bit too late. A neighbor has seen the theft and calls the police, and Brescia and her friend are arrested, and they have stolen exactly $80 worth of items, which they returned. So let's take Vernon Prater, who's 41 and has a long rap sheet, including robbery with gun, and he's caught in Home Depot, I think it was, shoplifting about $82 worth of equipment. And he too is arrested and taken down to the police office. And both of them are administered this risk assessment tool called Compass. And Brescia, who's had very minor, some misdemeanors, nothing that would be unusual for somebody who grew up poor and in a difficult environment. And she scores an 8 out of 10 on the Compass score, and she is not released on bail yet, and she spends a few days in prison crying while her family tries to scrape together $1,000. And meanwhile, Prater, who's got this long rap sheet, has already spent time in prison, scores a 3, and he's released on his own recognizance. So how does this happen? As Julia just mentioned, if we look at some of Compass's questions, and there are 137 of them, I believe, race is not one of them. But if you have to put in your home address, for example, your zip code is highly correlated with your race. If you were asked about your educational level or your employment status, was one of your parents ever sent to jail or prison? How many of your friends, acquaintances are taking drugs illegally? Have you or your friends ever been arrested for drug use? Now, we know in the United States that blacks and whites smoke pot at the same level, but blacks are 5 times as likely to be arrested for smoking pot. So is that a question that is going to be equitable to ask? How often did you get into fights while at school? True or false, a hungry person has a right to steal? True or false, if people make me angry and I lose my temper, I can be dangerous. How does this happen? So obviously, there must have been really robust testing of this tool, right? If it's going to be used to make these kinds of decisions about people. Well, it turns out as of 2016, even though Compass was being used for sentencing decisions, the Sentencing Commission had never done an analysis of the risk scores. While it's used in many, many jurisdictions across the US, very few independent studies have been done of these tools. And in fact, most of the testing that has been done under unknown circumstances with unknown data by the same company that has developed the instrument. So it's sort of shocking. And it was found that these scores were remarkably unreliable in forecasting violent crimes. Only 20% of the people who were predicted to commit violent crimes actually went on to do so. When you looked at the overall spectrum of crimes, including misdemeanors like driving with an expired license, the algorithm was about a little better than a coin flip. So of those deemed likely to reoffend, 61%, only 61% were arrested for a subsequent crime within 2 years, which was the standard they were using. Now, if you think about that, how many of you would take a drug that the government had tested and said was 61% effective and had side effects, and bad side effects? I don't think too many of us would take that drug. So the tools were moderate at best in terms of their predictive ability. But they were masking a problem that Julia referenced. And that's the problem of false negatives and false positives. So there are two kinds of errors an algorithm can make. One is a false positive. So that's when you take the pregnancy test and it tells you you're pregnant when you're not. And they can also make false negatives, which is you take the pregnancy test and it tells you you're not pregnant when you are. And the problem sometimes with these tools when people report accuracy is that accuracy can mask differences in false positives and false negatives. And what ProPublica found when they started to dig into this data is that it predicted very differently for blacks and whites. So the false positives, the brunt of those kinds of errors fell on blacks, and the false negatives, the brunt of those, the whites got the benefit. So you were much more likely to be labeled higher risk and not reoffend if you were black, and you were much more likely to be labeled lower risk and yet reoffend if you were white. And that's, you know, a real problem when the algorithm, when the overall accuracy masks some kind of problem like this. And often that question is never even asked unless you have journalists who are interested in actually getting to the bottom of this. So I've talked a little bit about the problem of bias in data. And it is a real problem because these machine learning algorithms eat this data and spit out predictions based on what the historical data has shown. And if the historical data carries with it the social bias that we have, it is moved into the future predictions. And part of the problem is the incentives for companies that, especially who are profit-making with tools like this, to do this independent validation, unless it's demanded by journalists and by the public, doesn't happen all that much. So I want to talk a little bit about what is called function creep, the problem about whether these tools are proprietary and kept secret. So that'll bring me into transparency and explainability. I'm going to talk about what I think is a crisis in competence that we have now. I'll touch on algorithmic bias and automation bias and close out with some thoughts about confidentiality and data privacy, which is our theme today. So here's an example of function creep. Compass was originally designed to provide insights into treatment of offenders. So does an offender need drug treatment? Do they need mental health treatment? That was originally what this questionnaire was for. Somehow it slid into being used for conditions of release after an arrest. So release with no bail, release with bail, or no release at all. And somehow it slid into decisions about sentencing and is now used in at least a dozen jurisdictions to make decisions about sentencing. And that's function creep, where something was not designed for the purpose it ends up being used for. And many people don't even know to ask that question. I suspect many of the jurisdictions that use this for sentencing have no clue that it was designed for a completely different purpose and may not have even been tested for the purpose it's being used for. What did Compass's developer say? I didn't design this software to be used in sentencing. But as time went on, I started to realize so many decisions are made in courts. So he gradually softened on whether this could be used in courts or not. And I suspect if there was a little bubble over this comment, it might be ka-ching, ka-ching. And I don't like the idea myself that Compass is being used as the sole evidence that a decision would be made on. So this is the person who developed and markets this. So the story gets worse. The story gets worse because this tool is used in Wisconsin for sentencing. So Mr. Loomis was driving the getaway car in a robbery, and he had prior offenses. So when he was going to be sentenced, the range was from something like 3 to 6 years. And this software was used to predict his likely recidivism rate, and he was scored very high for recidivism, and so he got the maximum sentence. And on appeal, Loomis argues this tool and the use of this tool violated his constitutional rights to due process because it wasn't developed for the purpose that it was being used for, and he wasn't able to challenge it or have his counsel challenge the scientific validity or reliability or accuracy of the tool because it was a proprietary tool, and North Point, who manufactured the tool, said, no, we're not sharing all this data, and we're not going to share how the algorithm works. And you would think the court might say this is a problem, but it went all the way up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and they ruled that actually he wasn't deprived of due process rights because it wasn't the sole consideration that was used in determining his sentence. And the case went up to the US Supreme Court, and they denied to review it. So it stands as a decision in Wisconsin approving essentially the use of these tools. So let's talk about what fairness, I want to talk about fairness in data and data usage, and then fairness in algorithms. So one of the things we ask when we're considering fairness in data usage is, what are the effects on individuals? What is the impact of how I'm using this data? How intrusive is it going to be? The second question, I think, is this use consistent with reasonable expectations? So if I go on this particular website, do I expect somebody to take my data and sell it to somebody else who can aggregate it and draw all kinds of conclusions about me? And I think fairness in this context has to do with transparency, both in letting the user know how the data is being collected, what data is being collected, and what's the potential impact on that person because of this data collection. I think the question of what it means for an algorithm to be fair is a much harder question. And we as a society, I think, have not really grappled with this. And we're letting developers of algorithms make this decision for us. And here's the issue. So some people, if I were to poll you, would think that for an algorithm to be fair, it means that everybody should be treated equally, and we should completely remove, for example, race and age and all these kinds of variables from the algorithms. Others of you would feel, no, to be fair, we have to deal with and address past inequities, so we ought to weight the algorithm to benefit certain people over others. And until we as a society decide what it means to be fair, don't have any idea what is going on in the background with many of these algorithms and which decision somebody has made, if any of these. The other, I think, problem that we have is, I want to call it a crisis in competence. So after the ProPublica article came out, there was a backlash of other studies trying to show that, that the article was wrong, the analysis was wrong, the statistics were wrong. And so I came upon this article, came out around the same time, a little bit later, and I read it, and I have a JD and a PhD. I teach in a computer science department. I could not assess who was right, which statistics were right. How do we expect our policymakers, our regulators, the public, to be able to assess information and figure out whether it's valid, whether it's not valid, when they can't understand the statistics and the language in some of the academic articles that we publish? The other problem, I think, that we have are two phenomena that, in addition to lack of knowledge and lack of competence, come into play. And the first, which I think is probably more salient in the area of this Compass tools, is automation bias. And that is, I used to think everything I read on the internet was true. It had to be true. It was on the internet. It was published. And so this is the belief that it popped out of a computer, and the numbers must be accurate because they're objective. And so the judge sees this 8 and automatically assumes the 8 is correct. And we have that bias, many of us. And the opposite bias, which is one I've struggled with in terms of some of the research that I do, is called algorithm aversion. And algorithm aversion goes something like this. So Berkeley Dietforst has done, at Penn, has done a lot of work on this. And so one of his typical studies might be the following. He has a bunch of subjects like you guys come in, and they look at a file of an MBA candidate. And so they're given the GRE scores, and they're given the grades in college, and they're given the highest level of schooling that the parents got, and a million other variables in a file. And then there's an algorithm that's also going to make the same prediction from the same information. And they do this 15, 20 times, and they see the algorithm beat them somewhere between 13 and 97% of the time, depending on how good they were in predicting. And then actually the study starts, and they say to them, we're going to pay you every time now that you get it, that you win and you're correct. So you can bet on the algorithm, you can bet on yourself, and in some of the conditions they had also seen some other person, a third person, make the predictions. And even though they have just watched for an hour, an algorithm beat them over and over and over again, they all bet on themselves. And it's a remarkable phenomena. And when you talk to the subjects, their explanation is, well, algorithms can't learn, and they make mistakes, and they can't get better. And they just assume that humans can learn from their mistakes and algorithms can't, which is not necessarily true. And not all humans learn from their mistakes either. And it's a very, very tough phenomena to deal with. And I dealt with it. My early work, probably that I'm most well known for, is showing that machine learning tools could beat lawyers in finding evidence in very, very large data sets. And we'd done the empirical work. I worked with a professor here from Waterloo, and we'd shown this. It was peer-reviewed and the whole 9 yards, and we couldn't get anybody to believe it. So one of the suggestions with these problems with algorithm and bias and so forth is let's go out and just get more data, because more data will be more representative and so forth. And obviously that will lead to better decision making, but it also leads to more privacy violations and insecurity in data and so forth. And we don't know whether it actually leads to better decision making, but it comes with significant trade-offs. And one of those is, for example, this study where there were 1.1 million credit card transactions over a 3-month period in 10,000 stores, and with 4 points of geospatial information, they could track back exactly who had made those purchases. And if you think about it, if we said 4'11", JD, Ph.D., Jewish, and female, it wouldn't be very hard to figure out who at Waterloo fit that description. So it's not that hard to roll it back. So let me not be all negative. I'll talk about a few possible ways we can address some of these problems. And the first one is with our education. And I think as we are here today bringing together many different disciplines, one of the things we have to do better is interdisciplinary training. We just don't do enough of that. I teach a course here called Artificial Intelligence, Law, Ethics, and Policy, and I bring 15 graduate students in computer science and 15 law students from Osgoode Hall Law School together. I connect the rooms by video, and we study those together, and my goal is to teach the lawyers and the future policymakers and lawyers about issues of technology and data privacy and data security, because they don't have that technical knowledge. Most of them went to law school like I did because they were bad in math and scored very high in the verbal skills. But equally, we have to teach computer and data scientists about the legal, ethical, and policy implications and things like privacy by design and by default, which you'll hear about a little bit later. And I'm always shocked when I start the semester and I sort of poll the students that the computer science students do not see data bias as their problem. Their problem is to optimize the algorithm, make it fast and better and so forth. But the data is just the data they were given. And they don't own that they may be the only people who are in the position to know that and to do anything about it and to do something about the algorithm. And the lawyers are clueless about how the technology works. And how can you possibly come up with the proper solutions if you don't understand anything about the data and the technology? The second source of possibly addressing this is through regulation. And you're going to hear more about general data protection regulation a little bit later today. But I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of automated decision making. This regulation came into effect in the European Union in 2018. And I'm going to talk about 3 particular aspects of it. One is the consent provisions. The second is what we call the right to be forgotten, or the right to erasure. And the third is the limitations it places on profiling and automated decision-making. And the law is a blunt instrument, and it has often unintended consequences. And this is new law, so we don't quite know yet what is going to happen in terms of impacts it's going to have that maybe weren't anticipated, especially by people who don't understand technology. So here, consent it has to be freely given, voluntary, meaningful, actual, real choice. It has to be specific. So when I log on to your site, just because you tell me you're going to collect my data, that isn't enough. If you plan to repurpose it or sell it, you would have to let me know that as well. It has to be informed, so it can't be in 7 clicks away in legalese that I couldn't possibly understand. It has to be unambiguous, so I have to take some clear affirmative action, not unchecking a box to opt out. And it has to be subject to withdrawal. For consent to be real, I have to be able to take it back. So I wonder if we really do have consent. I was doing research for this talk today, and I came on a site for the GDPR, this privacy regulation, and it asked me to say okay, that they could have my cookies. And I couldn't read the damn article because I didn't want to check the box. And that's not real consent. If we can't participate in the world, the online world, without being able to say no and still read the article. And there's so many sites on the web where if you don't check the box, you can't play. The second is this right to erasure. And this regulation says that a person has the right to get back, erase this data on him without undue delay, anytime they withdraw consent. But what happens when their data was in the Compass algorithm or any other algorithm, and how do you give that data back in any realistic way? So I wonder if this is a real right, because how do you get something off the web completely? Maybe you could make it so that a Google search won't find it, but that still doesn't erase all of it. So this may or may not be a real right in the first place. And so what this regulation says about solely automated decision making is that I have the right not to be subject to a decision about me that is solely based on an automated process, including profiling, and that it has to have legal effects on me or similar effects. So let me unpack this a little bit for you. We lawyers like to play with this kind of language and see what it means. So profiling is any automated processing of your personal information that's used to evaluate or predict something about you, something about your performance at work or your health, your economics, your personal preferences, your interests, and so forth. So where do organizations get their information from? We know basically all of your internet searches are being tracked. Your buying habits are being monitored. And all of us are giving, again, if you're not paying for the service, then you're the product. We're giving our data away in exchange for convenience. So from our mobile phones, from our social networking sites, from the sensors that are now everywhere, and the Internet of Things, all of the connected devices. And it's shocking, again, with my students at the beginning of the semester. I always poll them to find out whether they're of the school of convenience. They'd rather get the coupons and the personalized ads, or whether they want the privacy. And other than the 1 or 2 students have been in Ian's class, all of them want the convenience. The ones in Ian's class are scared to death, and they have their little flip phones and things like that, and they don't participate in the internet at all because they know better. What is this? What's this data being used for? They want to find out something about you, typically your characteristics or your preferences. They want to predict your future behavior. Are you likely to buy a new pair of sneakers in the next, couple of weeks? And make some kind of decision. Is this person willing to pay more for for car insurance, then, you know, are they a stupid idiot because their time is more valuable for them and they don't want to look around and spend time doing that. But that's what organizations want to do. They want to classify you into some group, or because they've done correlations between the group you're in and some behavior that's of interest to them. So automated decision-making is a decision made by some kind of algorithm or computer software and without any human involvement. So that decision can be based on factual information that you've actually provided yourself or somebody observing you. Or it can be some kind of digitally created profile where information is drawn in from multiple sources. And we all know about a mosaic theory that you may be unidentifiable from one source, but when you put 5 or 10 sources together, it's very easy to figure out who you are. So examples of this automated decision, there are now tools that will decide whether to award you a loan, whether you're eligible for certain social services, whether to interview you for a position just by analyzing your resume, and even should you benefit for a certain medical treatment based on your likelihood of success or your likelihood to comply with the treatment regimen, or you're being in a certain group or having certain characteristics. So solely automated decision means solely automated. It's totally automated. There's no human influence in the outcome. A process isn't solely automated if someone interprets the results. So if you think back to Compass and the judge looks at it, the decision, the score, and maybe considers a few other factors, that's no longer considered solely automated, and it's not under this regulation anymore. So it says that the decision, in order to fall under this regulation, must have a legal effect, meaning it has to affect a legal right that you have. That might be a right to freedom or a right to health coverage. It depends on the country what are considered legal rights. Or it has to have a similar significant effect. And we don't know what this means yet because it hasn't been tested enough in the legal system. I suspect showing you ads will not be considered a similar, significant effect. I think something like deciding whether to interview you for a position would be a similar legal effect. So what they look at to make this determination is what's the impact or what's the effect on financial circumstances. So getting a mortgage or not getting a mortgage can make the difference between being able to have a home and not have a home. Your health, your employment opportunities, housing, behavior, reputation, and choice. So there are a few other collateral rights that come with this regulation. If you're unhappy with a solely automated decision, you can ask for a review by a human, and the decision maker has to be able to show you how and why it reached that particular decision. So it has to be explainable to some degree, which rules out lots of technologies like deep learning where people can't explain them and they don't know why the algorithm came to the decision it did. And I think this brings up the issue of, are we willing to trade off some predictive accuracy for transparency? Is transparency a higher value that we're willing to give up some of the predictive ability of the algorithm so we can explain it? The system has to be able to provide an audit trail. It has to be able to show what key points rendered the decision, and there has to be an opportunity for an appeal. So somebody has to take into account not only the algorithm, but any additional evidence that somebody can provide in support of overruling that decision. So we don't know enough about whether this kind of regulation will have unintended effects, will impair innovation, but this is one approach that countries can take to get some control over this kind of algorithms. The second would be what I will call public algorithmic auditing or some kind of certification process. So Andrew Tutt wrote an interesting article, I think, to have my class read, about creating the essentially an FDA for algorithms, like what we do with drug testing. And for certain kinds of algorithms that have significant legal, social impacts, you would have to send your algorithm in and have it examined publicly by this commission, and it would have to get a seal of approval in essence. Now, there are some problems with this. If we think about the United States as an example, because I'm from the US, many of these agencies get completely captured by corporate entities. So if you think, for example, of the Boeing 737 MAX cases where the FAA was basically deferring to Boeing's decisions about the planes. And this happens because the companies that have this data are so huge and so powerful, would this kind of agency even work? Second problem is, can we get enough competence and interdisciplinary people in this kind of agency? Right now, a lot of the brightest minds in working on algorithms can go to Silicon Valley for millions of dollars and options, stock options and things like that, and are not going to be willing to work for the kind of salary that a public agency would give. The next approach is to have it private algorithmic auditing and certification. So Kathy O'Neill spoke at the University of Waterloo, I think about a year ago, and she has opened, she's the person who wrote the book Weapons of Math Destruction, and is very interested in bias in algorithms. And she opened a company called Orca that will come in to a company and assess the algorithms that they're using for bias and give you sort of a good housekeeping seal of approval if it passed her test. And, you know, query whether this is the kind of approach that we want, and what has happened with all the big auditing companies in the United States, again, where they have their client that they're making a lot of money from, find it very hard to say, you've got an accounting problem here, because then they lose all the revenue for all the tax work that they do for that particular client. So I don't know if this model would work. So that leaves me with, I wanted to spend the last few minutes that we have to ask you guys, what are the solutions? Do you see any other solutions other than the ones that have been proposed here? How do we deal with this problem of bias in data? And the more we collect, the more invasions of privacy we have, and the more injustice that gets perpetuated. Thank you.
So I was just watching a video Steve Wozniak was saying when he was working at the first Apple computer, when he was sneaking in the big data centers that had the locks, the doors unlocked, so he can practice programming. Yeah. So he was a rebel that, if we think in a surveillance society, he will be labeled as a bad guy. Yeah. And the same thing we can argue if the United States of America could have, would be able to have a revolution if you were in the surveillance society. Yeah? So there is this point that sometimes benevolent rebels are good for society. Yeah? So, I mean, on one hand, we can explain the need for surveillance because social media and the internet and the connectivity, it's a very powerful force that could be evil. Yeah? So on one hand, you need surveillance against the bad guys, but then if you exaggerate on the other side, you will forbid these benevolent rebels to progress the society. Yeah? So I mean, my point of view is for the decision makers, you know, when they take this decision, you know, what's their thinking? Because if you go to extreme with surveillance, then you don't have democracy anymore. Yeah. So there's just a thought there.
We have a similar problem, I think, with when you think of Apple and the phones. If we create the phones with such strong encryption that nobody can get into them, what about the legitimate law enforcement needs? So you might want that 9 days out of 10, but if your child was kidnapped, maybe you would want to get on somebody's phone to find out the GPS or something like that. And which way do we go? Because, you know, once there's that back door, there's the back door for everybody, not just for good purposes, but for bad purposes. So there's this duality.
Hello. Our society actually developed very much, and we don't need a lot of labor in farming and production. So what do you think, like, as a solution, as a suggestion? Let's produce more lawyers, students, who will work instead of these algorithms helping the judges. What do you think about it? Like going back to the human neural stuff.
We have a problem, at least in the US, in the legal system. 80% of people who need legal services can't afford them. And we have laws about the unauthorized practice of law. So only a lawyer trained who's passed the bar can practice law. But if 80% of the people's needs aren't being met, people are starting to develop algorithmic tools that will help somebody figure out, do they have a claim or not, how to fill out a form, and so forth. And lawyers have been fighting against the use of this tool because they're terrified it's going to impact their income. But the truth is, these 80% of the people who are using these kinds of tools are not the people who are coming to the lawyers that they're making money from anyway.
Hi. Thanks for your talk. It was really interesting. I was trying to formulate a question. So your topic of function creep reminded me of the implementation of predictive policing and how it was based on originally the idea that you can predict aftershocks from earthquakes and use a very similar algorithm to predict future crimes. And the fact that you turned the how do we solve this problem onto the audience doesn't help me turn this into a question very well. But it seems like more transparency and more investigation into the use of these types of algorithms, such as what Julia and ProPublica did, and hopefully what the markup does, will help to, you know, enlighten the public that these exist and are being used in ways that are not obvious and disadvantage certain populations. Do you know of other outlets that are looking to provide this type of publication other than like ProPublica and markup, maybe like in the academic field?
I'm not aware of any other than the websites that try to assess the truth of information. I know that I'm working with a group in the Department of Computer Science that we're trying to use machine learning to find and also impact health misinformation on the web. There is so much of it, and we all go online because we have some symptom, and we type in, you know, red patchy skin or whatever, and then we go online, oh, that's what it is, and it says to get this stuff or to take this pill. And there's so much misinformation, and one of the things we're trying to do is to see, are there ways to use machine learning to give credibility scores or to do something so that somebody can assess that. And I think some of the same work is being done using algorithms to try to suss out truth versus not truth. The problem in the political sphere is, unlike health, where there's a black and white answer, you can go actually find it out. With something that's more related to opinions, yes, there are some things that either happened or didn't happen. You know, Trump either lied about something or he didn't. But some of the other issues in the political sphere fall into a gray area of opinion.
Hello? Okay, there we go. So thank you for presenting my work. I've never actually sat in the audience watching someone else present. It was really fun. Thank you. I wanted to say two things. One is actually for the question before, there are some academic research groups that are doing like algorithmic bias investigations. I think Northeastern has a lab at Northeastern University, and then also the Princeton Center for Technology and Policy, I've forgotten what it's called,
Yes.
CTIP,
Yeah.
does some of this work. So there are little pockets of research that I often confer with when I'm doing algorithmic investigations. It's becoming a field of research. It's worth pointing out, though, that in the US, I don't know what the law is here, there's a real challenge for this type of research, which is there's a law in the US called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which makes it a criminal violation to basically automatically scrape large amounts of data across the internet. And so that means that it's really legally risky to do the type of work that my newsroom does, which is collect data at scale. Because the idea is if you violate the terms of service, so if some website says on their terms of service, which no one reads, don't take data from our website, they can just say that and then you're breaking the law if you do it. And so there have been different rulings in different jurisdictions in the US about whether this law really applies to journalists and academics doing research in the public interest and data that's publicly available. But there's no settled law right now, so a lot of research is actually hampered by the fact that not a lot of institutions are willing to take this legal risk. So one of the things that the markup has done is we have my co-founder, Nabiha Syed, who's the president of the markup, is a noted firebrand First Amendment lawyer. And so essentially we're ready for, we know we're going to have a lawsuit, and so we're ready for that. But not all universities are really set up for that, nor do they want to take that risk. But I was actually going to answer your question about what we can do about algorithms. And I just want to throw out something, so this is not a solution. I just want to throw out one thing that is often proposed as a solution and caution you all against it, which is there's a contingent out there that says, the way to make algorithms unbiased and to solve this problem is just to make the algorithms themselves transparent. And it's a common thing that's thrown out there, and I want to say that it's actually a false god. And the reason is twofold. One, Compass, the algorithm that I wrote about, so the night before we were going to publish, we sent our work and our data to the founder, and he was very upset actually with the findings, and he was like, no, of course we didn't mean to be biased, and and so at the last minute he said, I'm going to show you the algorithm. You can't ever tell anyone what it looks like, so I'm not going to tell you guys what it was, but you'll see that there's no bias in it. So I looked at the algorithm. It's a linear equation, right? And it has he didn't give me the number, so it's just a constant times a variable, whatever. And obviously, yeah, I challenge any mathematician to look at that and say, oh, the false positive rate for black defendants is going to be twice that of white defendants. You can't tell that from looking at that equation. You have to examine the outputs and the disparate impact. And so item one is, I don't think that even if that algorithm was transparent, there would be a way to know that outcome. Secondly, as you probably all know, in the world of machine learning, these algorithms are not actually fixed. They change, and the analysis is constantly evolving, and so there's no way to see them. They don't exist. This is an argument that a lot of AI researchers make, which is they don't know what the algorithm is doing. It's just out there making its own decisions, and so there's no way to audit it. And so I guess I just want to throw into that conversation that if anyone says to you that the transparency of the algorithm is the solution, that's not true.
Right, I agree.
Hi, thank you. That was fascinating, and my question kind of picks up on your predecessor's comment. Is there anything that developers can do to protect themselves from function creep? I mean, is there something in the law that says a developer can ensure that this technology is not used for XYZ purposes?
I think they can make disclosures. Whether that stops people from using it for a different purpose is a different story. But I suppose, no, even here with intellectual property protection, it moved on and to other purposes. I think if you're making things open source, I suppose you could put a license for how it can be used if it's open source. But a lot of these tools are proprietary.
Does this work? Hello? I don't have any solutions, sorry. Just more questions. And I guess the big question I'm thinking of is we're talking about truth, right? We're talking about how good algorithms are at finding the truth. And it makes me think, and maybe this is a depressing look at society, but I think of the elephant and the rider analogy or metaphor, where much of the public and society's decisions are emotionally driven and not truth. So maybe I'm taking too many steps back, but I'm thinking, how much appetite do we have for the truth these days in today's society? Mm-hmm. Because it seems that, and I think the Russian troll network on Twitter understands this very well, that we respond very much to emotions. So how do we overcome that aspect of it to make this kind of work meaningful?
So I'm going to roll your question comment back a little, and I'm not sure that I buy the premise about looking for truth with these tools. We are making predictions that have a margin of error, right? It's not necessarily the truth. It is a prediction about what somebody might do, what they might buy, whether they would be a recidivist. And I'm not sure we care about the truth always in the use of these algorithms. And I think people forget that it's just a guess. It's a guess based on historical information that may or may not be representative. And it's making some kind of guess about the future with some margin of error. But I think part of the problem is maybe we're not even educated enough to know what the right questions to ask in the first place are. But I wouldn't necessarily equate what these tools do with the truth as opposed to just some assumption or correlation, because often some of these correlations have nothing to do with cause. They're just correlations.
All right, we're out of time, I'm afraid. So let's thank Maura again.
Thank you.